Okay, yes.
Good afternoon here in the UK. Good morning if you're in a different part of the world. An evening, maybe you're in a different part of the world again. So we're still getting a few people coming, excuse me, but I think it's just past the hour. So we'll start and then hopefully we'll have lots of times for questions at the end. I'm going to share my screen. Because I've put together just a slide to introduce the session title to everybody. So we have a really good panel, I think, coming up in the next hour and a half. Before that, we have to remind everybody about the policy, and it will be posted in the chat. I think you're all very familiar with it now. The policy on harassment, that it will not be tolerated. And then there's a list of people there for you to report any concerns to. Secondly, sorry, I'm getting the... Secondly, I just wanted to give a final plug, I think, for everybody this week. To attend the Environmental Peacebuilding Awards and Dialogue, which takes place at 3 o'clock Central European time, so just about half an hour after we finish our session today. Okay, first of all then, if I just go back, sorry, to the opening title. So over the past 2 years then, over the past 2.5 days, I'll get there in a second, we've heard from contributors from many disciplines, and perspectives on a rich mix of topics in relation to environmental peace building. For our panel, we have brought together 3 speakers who will help us to explore both the theoretical underpinnings and the mechanics of environmental peace building through practical examples in different regions of the world. For example, questions such as, do current peace building approaches pay sufficient attention to the contribution that the environment can make towards a lasting peace? Or are governments and international organizations involved in peace building processes taking a wrong turn? How can we ensure the environment is not forgotten in such situations? And better still, how can we ensure positive ecological peace? As we only have 3 speakers in our panel, we're very privileged, I think, to have 3 speakers, because what it means that I've been able to allocate up to about 15 minutes per speaker. And so I don't want them to feel that they have to rush through their presentation. As I say, though, we will have lots of time for questions at the end. So please post your questions in the chat, or you can send them to me or the tech team directly, and we will pose them to the panel members at the end. First up, if I just go back to, first up we have Fábio. You can see his full bio on the screen there. He's a junior researcher and PhD candidate, and he's looking particularly at issues of environmental peace building and the creation of sustainable peace in post-conflict contexts. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand over to Fábio.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm truly happy to be part of this panel and to finally be able to discuss my subject or research with other fellow colleagues. So against many brilliant presentations that I've seen so far, I have to admit that mine is much more modest and heavily theoretical. So I hope that you can keep up until the end, and I apologize in advance for that. So the focus of my research is how the UN can promote sustainable peace in post-conflict environmental peace building. Accordingly, my argument is divided in these three main dimensions. So I consider the environment as an add-on dimension to the current United Nations peace building architecture. On the other hand, peace building, I see it as a short-term technical approaches that being privileged over long-term and environmental and resource availability concerns. And sustainable peace, I see that it can be achieved by grassroots initiatives towards the prevention, resolution of, and recovery from conflict. So given that my point of departure is the political expressions of the environment itself, I started my research by focusing exactly on how environmentalism transformed the United Nations political landscape over time. So following all of these environmental landmarks that you can see on the screen right now, it is today very clear that states can no longer ignore environmental problems at all. Notwithstandingly, we see that the increasingly complex UN arrangements in place have very much fall short in making up for the academic expectations regarding the integration of the environment in politics. So what we see the most is a series of agreements that often fail or that are poorly matched to the day-to-day intersections of environment and peace at the interstate level. And that we see that in many of these agreements, the peace and conflict are not even mentioned at all. So the fact is that this initial push towards environmental action has in fact concretized in some sort of lack of political coordination and accountability that in turn led to a fragmented regulatory system and to several rhetorical commitments. Well, given this, it seems that the environment itself has not been quite an integrative part of policymaking thus far, but rather a sideline dimension mobilized selectively and with insufficient expression. And I've noticed there are several evidence to support this claim. Well, first and foremost, we can see that the environment has had, especially since the Brundtland report in 1987, a negative connotation because it is seen as an external threat to human affairs. In this sense, environmental challenges are not seen as an opportunity to build peace, but are rather seen as a threat that, such as climate change, seen as a threat multiplier, need to be securitized in order, using technical approaches and sorts of extraordinary measures to deal with the sources of environmental degradation. Also, especially since the 90s, we've seen the rise of this logic of market environmentalism that seeks to legitimate economic growth in the context of environmental protection. Well, all of these has contributed to the deployment of ephemeral technocratic solutions that I can describe them as initiatives that seek to achieve inclusiveness, environmental sustainability, and peace in one strike, while neglecting or marginalizing the root causes of environmental degradation that may or not reignite hostilities between conflicting parties in the first place. Well, for all of these reasons, I consider that the environment has been like a second tier in matters of international peace and security. Well, given this, how exactly has been integration of an environmental component in the United Nations peacebuilding missions? Well, as this sentence illustrates very clearly, and I quote, "There can be no durable and sustainable peace if natural resources that sustain livelihoods and ecosystem are destroyed or degraded," end of quote. However, on a practical level, the environment and peace building has not always been compatible or even consistent with each other. So, for instance, the creation of natural protected areas in some countries can be clogged by land disputes, whereas reconciliation between former conflicting parties can be hindered by competition over scarce natural resources. So, despite both the international architecture for the creation of peace and global environmental politics have quite emerged simultaneously, let's say in patchwork fashion, the fact is that their coexistence has proven to be a complex, rather challenging task. Given this, we've seen that the environment has been hardly integrated in peace building's policy formation, and at the same time, peace building has been quite overlooking the root causes of environmental degradation that could engender grievances, tensions, and/or conflict. However, as it is clear to all of us, peace is a prerequisite to tackle environmental degradation and resource scarcities. And peace building has taken this into consideration for a few years now over these so-called post-liberal conceptions, such as the one based on notions of the spatial turn, the local turn, and notions of the everyday, that seem to have an intrinsic potential to address environmental issues by implementing initiatives from the grassroots and not just top-down initiatives. Well, given all this, we reach post-conflict environmental peace building. Ideally, how should we conceptualize post-conflict environmental peace building? Well, in my view, it should be a long-term community-driven sustainable environmental project that must, first and foremost, depart from the negative connotation that is attributed to the environment, as I've mentioned before, as a catalyst of instability and conflict. So the logic that we seek to achieve in practice is the one of environmental peace. That is, that shared environmental problems should be or act as incentives for cooperation in order to avert the deterioration into conflict through the promotion of sustainable grassroots initiatives rather than top-down initiatives that really don't take into consideration the full capacity and means of the local populations that are being intervened upon. Well, over these last years, we've seen that there are mainly three actors responsible for the employment of environmental peace building in post-conflict context. We have first the United Nations Environmental Programme, then the Post-Conflict Disaster and Management Branch, and last but not least, the Peace Building Commission. Well, most of my original work, let's say, of my thesis will be focused on these actors and try to explain how they co-opt environmental peace building and what is left in the middle, what is left between environmental theoretical premises and what they really do in policy implementation. But for now, I've tried to synthesize it very simply in order for you to understand what are their role in the implementation of environmental peace building. Well, starting from the environmental program, we've seen that they consider environment as a critical peace building tool, especially in post-conflict reconstruction, and that natural resources management initiatives are seen as a pathway for cooperation, transformation, and consolidation of peace. However, in most of the initiatives that they have taken in the last years, and especially in the last decade, they've privileged international ownership over grassroots initiatives. So in fact, not much has evolved considerably in this aspect. Then there is also the question that the United Nations Environmental Programme lacks several logistical and financial resources, which impair most of the long-term initiatives that they seek to implement on the field. Well, the post-conflict disaster management branch is also a creation of an app, and it seeks mainly to conduct field-based assessments, post-conflict environmental recovery, and disaster risk reduction initiatives. However, just like UNEP, it has such a limited funding and a lack of a conflict prevention mandate that when we are in the scenarios where hostilities are still present, their initiatives are not so well succeeded. So there's a clear lack of capacity to implement successful environmental peacebuilding initiatives. When we go higher up in the rank of the UN, we have the Peacebuilding Commission that serves mainly as an advisory body that answers to the United Nations General Assembly and the Economic and Social Council. However, this actor clearly lacks the bureaucratic clout and financial resources to make environmental peacebuilding as a distinct branch of peacebuilding per se. And what do I mean about this? I mean that there is only an environmental supplement to peacebuilding missions that is being applied selectively on a case-by-case basis. And then with this, I mean that the environment is not an integrative part of all peacebuilding missions as I consider that it should be. Well, in terms of concrete operationalization, how has this been mobilized? Well, in terms of the United Nations Environmental Programme, it has applied several natural resource management initiatives, most recently in Iraq, Sudan, Colombia, and Yemen. Not all of them have been successful, not all of them have been taken in the long term, so there is much to be done, especially still in these countries. However, several non-governmental organizations seem to be very prepared to implement the concept. We have the examples of EcoPeace Middle East, the Good Neighbors Project, Tear Fund, and Taibas in Yemen, that seem to sort of be successful in implementing grassroots initiatives, something that UNEP has not been able to do thus far. Last but not least, is also to mention the community-led practices that have been successful so far. We have, for example, the case of India, Bangladesh, and India, Pakistan, that has implemented initiatives in youth engagement educational projects. We have the case of tree planting in the Sahel region. And lastly, we have the documented case of Tarabandu that was recently presented by Hyde, Lisa Palmer, and Barnett, that is an initiative that seeks to achieve natural resources management, social conflicts, and spiritual relations between former conflicting parties. So, in light of the foregoing, how can we, well, which prospects can we trace for the concept's mobilization towards the promotion of sustainable peace? Well, there are several pathways that I have identified in how environmental peace building could contribute to sustainable peace. I've divided them in three categories per se, but they're all interconnected between themselves. So going from the left to the right, we have the academic, the environmental, and the UN/policymaking fields. Starting from the left then, first and foremost, I believe there is a clear necessity to expand the evidence base for environmental peace building, not only to make the field less deductive and theory-driven, but also to present more empirical cases that could help to surpass the challenges of intersectionality, and the different terminology that is being applied, because it's not when policymakers perceive this term, they are not always confronted with environmental peace building, but there are also notions of environmental peacemaking, ecological diplomacy, and peace ecology. So all of this confusion needs to go away as quickly as possible in order to convince policymakers and donors that this concept is relevant and is ready to be fully applied in post-conflict contexts. So going over to the academic field, to the environmental field, there's a need to emphasize the environment as an integral variable to conflict prevention and resolution, overcoming the dissociation between the environment and peace building, and lastly, pushing for binding international environmental frameworks that could make the concept of environmental peace building relevant in the field. In terms of the UN itself, there is a necessity to review the UN's peacebuilding architecture, like it has been in the last few years, in order not just to match environmental peacebuilding theoretical premises with political action, but also to replace the technocratic solutions that I speak before with community-led forms of environmental peacebuilding that could produce more fruitful results. Well, that's all for me, and thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Fábio, and thank you for sticking to time. I will share my screen again, hopefully that one, so that I can put up the bio of our next speaker. So Nicola is going to speak next, and he's going to be, I think, looking at a specific example for us. So Nicola, over to you.
All right, I just for a second I lost my Zoom. It was a bit scary. All right, thank you very much. I apologize for the voice, but this is literally the first thing that I'm pronouncing this morning. All right. Good. So if there is a chance that I apologize in advance. I know it's not professional, but it's Zoom tolerable. That if my baby starts screaming and crying because I wake her up, that I will have to run just to hand in the milk and then to come back, because in addition I'm alone home with her. So I apologize in advance if that happens. So thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to talk to all of you, and thanks a lot for the rest of the people for joining us today. I'm joining from Mexico City. But originally I'm from Serbia. But already my kind of professional career and path is pretty much linked to Latin, Central America, North America, depending how you refer and look into Mexico. So I'm going to be looking into a specific example, and actually Fábio's introduction came very neatly to me, building up on the theoretical aspects in which I'm not going to look at. I am actually a relatively newcomer to the field, and I am still trying to build up actually the methodology and the research questions and all those things that imply in academia to look into specific cases in Mexico of the environmental degradation and how the environmental degradation, access to resources and everything that it carries is affecting and boosting insecurity that is already a big issue in Mexico. For the sake of the context, just the latest data that I was researching, we have had last year 35,000 homicides in 1 year in Mexico. The data goes anything from the average around 30 persons being killed per 100,000 people to on average in Mexico to 164 persons per 100,000 people in places such as Tijuana, Ciudad Juarez, where we know that we have organized crime groups, narco cartels, and so on. So we have a high level of violence, street crime, kidnapping, extortion, and so on. This is not an invitation for you to come to Mexico. Still, the country remains relatively safe for the tourists in other parts of Mexico, but that's exactly where we are heading, because we might be heading towards a securitization of certain regions that have been exploring and facing relatively modest and acceptable or expected levels of crime and of violence, but facing other types of issues. As such, also Mexico is one of the countries in the world that has the highest and the biggest population of indigenous groups. And this is where we are heading for now. So I'm going to be looking into a specific case or project, a mega project, a flagship initiative actually, which is development of or building the construction of so-called train Maya. Train Maya or Mayan train, depending how authors refer to it. We are going to see a bit of data now, better. So to put a bit in the context, in 2018, Mexico got a new president for the term of 6 years. His name is Andrés Manuel López Obrador, or as we and majority of people refer to him as AMLO, to his initiatives, abbreviation of his name. In 2018, in December, he came to power, and he ran the campaign. He's often regarded as a populist leader, leftist. Those things are already kind of problematic when we try to depict and to describe a modern politician these days. But he ran a populist leftist campaign with a high level of promise of ending up corruption and ending up neoliberal policies. Actually, one of his favorite terms in his speeches and discourses that he runs is that he's fighting against the conservatism, conservativists, and neoliberal policies and neoliberal options. Throughout his campaign, he promised three major flagship projects for you, maybe to be able to identify the scale of these projects and the promises that he was making throughout the campaign. You can compare it to something that was also not so dear to us Mexicans, is Donald Trump's promise to build a wall with Mexico. So on that scale of level of promises is the situation in which we have been listening about the projects. Majority of the projects that he has been promising, particularly these three, actually have a remarkable environmental dimensions. One is the so-called Dos Bocas refinery in Gulf of Mexico. One is the cancellation of a new airport that we desperately need here in Mexico City, that already underwent in the previous administration. He canceled the ongoing construction and entirely moved the construction or a reconstruction of existing airport that is further away from Mexico City. And he passed that project in the hands of military. You'll see afterwards why is that interesting and important. And then the third one is actually the one that we are going to be looking at today, that I'm going to look into today, is the train Maya. He ran the so-called public consultations. So for these projects to go forward with them, he ran two series actually of public consultations. The first public consultation was held entirely out of the legal context. It was run actually by the supporters of his political party immediately as he came to rule, to administration, and with a minimum participation of the people, less than 2% of people who participated in this mock of a referendum. He got the support, of course, of 98% of the people to go forward with those projects. However, later on, when it came to the construction of the Tren Maya, he organized within the realm of the legal aspects and following the rules. He organized another set of the consultations. However, there is a bit of problems also there. So before I go into the details about the project itself, so this is where we can locate the ongoing projects, the south and southeast of Mexico. So we are here talking about the region. Mexico City is here. So we are talking about the region that covers 5 states. It's called Chiapas, Tabasco, crossing here, Campeche, Yucatan, and Quintana Roo. Probably some of you have been or have heard of famous places like Cancun, Playa Carmen, Merida, and Yucatan. So it's a Yucatan Peninsula in general, area of enormous natural importance, as it covers the northern parts of the biospheric mesocentric area, the tropical forests. In total, more than 25 actually naturally protected areas and zones of a remarkable importance for the maintenance of biodiversity. 10% of total species actually across the globe are found here, and this region constitutes of one of the most important biodiversity regions in the world. Why south and southeast are so important? Because historically speaking, it is regarded as a region that has been excluded from big projects. Chiapas, right? You have probably heard of Chiapas, tropical region with important now I'm switching to Spanish in my head. I apologize for this because the last time I spoke about it was in Spanish. So we have heard of it. It's the poorest, actually the poorest region in Mexico. We are talking here about 60-something% of poverty. Predominantly, the big population is indigenous, a beautiful place for tourists, very unfortunate when it comes to the development. But on the other side, it has very low scales of violence. Then other states that we see here, Tabasco, Campeche, Yucatan, experience somewhat better human development index scores and somewhat lesser scores when it comes to poverty, high levels of social inequality. And then we have Quintana Roo, who is of the 5 states probably the most developed because of the big important sector of industry that brings an enormous income to the region. However, contrary to the 4 other states, in Quintana Roo we do see higher levels of violence and homicides. And according to the researchers, the principal actually reason for that is uncontrolled development of tourist industry, arrival of organized crimes and organized crime groups. So this is relatively important for us to understand, because the entire project is divided into 7 different sections, and each section actually starts to be built as a kind of stage. So we go from the first to the second to the third to the fourth. It doesn't happen simultaneously. Why is this relevant? Because as everything was done in a very fast manner because of the face-saving situation for the president, what we are currently seeing is that for the each session, currently there is a 40% under the construction, and we have achieved more or less the section 4, which is connecting more or less the Yucatan, Merida, Izamal to Cancun. Is that everything is done in stages, including the environmental impact assessments. So environmental impact assessments, you would assume that when people were consulted through the referendums and so on, that people, particularly indigenous groups, would be able to access as much information as possible, to get informed about the impact, socio-economical and environmental impact of the project. But that's not the case, because the state institutions are running the environmental impact assessments actually as the project adapts and continues, which is causing a lot of controversies, particularly among the people who are living in the region. The estimated costs, let's see actually that one in the next slide. Some technical aspects. We are talking here about 1,525 kilometers of the routes, out of which actually some of particularly the first 2 tracks are actually the existing train tracks. The rest is going to be entirely built from scratch. 19 stations. The stations are regarded as very important hubs, because the stations are places where people are going to hop on and hop off, and consequently to induce presumably the development of the region. And 41 plus municipalities. And one of the aspects that is very controversial is that they opted for the diesel-powered engines. So the engines that spew the biggest amount of pollution and the CO2 in the atmosphere. The reason why they decided to do that is because of the lack of the power supply by electricity, and because it reduces significantly the costs of the projects. It's planned that it's used the transport for the locals populations, who are going to have much lower to pay much lower prices of the train tickets, tourists and cargo. It's expected actually that it's going to be transporting more than 50,000 passengers per day, which is a significant increase of arrival of people in the zone, in the area. Estimated costs or underestimated official costs are up to $7.8 billion. However, the independent groups have estimated it's going to go beyond $24 billion US, which is an enormous investment, particularly because the president is trying to keep the entire investment predominantly public one, feeding off from the tourists' fees and from the budget. The idea of the goals is to improve the poor infrastructure, interconnectivity, to boost the economical development, job creations, investments, living standard, and to decrease social inequalities and to uplift the poverty. The idea is that it's operational by December 23. However, it's already behind the schedule, even though the president is pushing very hard. He wants to have it inaugurated before the end of his term in 2024. However, even the engineers and the companies are warning that it's too fast for the scale of the project and the terrain in which it's going to build, possibly causing the accidents in the region. So this is a very interesting part. Now, trying to control my time, but I think that I have more or less 5 minutes, right? Karen? Yeah, I think, yeah. So in December 2019, the public consultations, referendums were held. 92.3% voted in favor, 7.4% against. However, the turnout was 2.36. So out of 3.5 million registered voters, or in total 100,000, 100 and almost 1,000 of people. Many controversies around the vote. Why is that so? Because according to the law in Mexico, particularly when we are talking about the region that is populated by indigenous groups, and this is one of the important regions we have only directly impacted by the train, directly. So if you count 1 kilometer from one side and the other side of the track, we have 143,000 native people. And in total, in the process that led up to the consultations, we have around only 10,000 of them being consulted. So this not necessarily is the problem, because often among the people who are consulted are the leaders of the groups. So communities operate and work in a way that the leaders of the ejidos, I will explain afterwards what the ejidos or leaders of the indigenous groups are the ones who are the most important one to be consulted, who then spread information. The problem was the lack of information and the access to information. The biggest controversy is the following. The state institution that is in charge for science and technology, it's called CONACYT, who funds the research in Mexico, invited around 30 high-level experts to run and to organize a report upon the potential impact of the Tren Maya in the region just before the consultancy or referendum was organized. And you would say that that's great, right? Because we have 30 highest experts in a very relatively short period of time. They had up to, I think it was 2 months to run this research. And 5 days or 7 days before the referendum, actually, so even throughout the process of consultation was held with indigenous groups, they sent their report and executive, right, kind of 60 pages, but they also sent the executive summary, and we never saw the publishing of that document. The research institution, the research institution who organized the call said that they don't want to publish the findings because they didn't want to impact the voting of the people, and that was actually the idea, to have the results ready, and then the people can get informed about the projects, which it did not happen. So the biggest complaint of various indigenous groups at the time, and it continues to be up until today, despite of the positive vote, is that that were completely ignored, and they were not provided with the information. And in addition, the consultations were predominantly one-way consultations, which means they were just spoken to. They were never asked about the ongoing or ideas of the projects that they might have that would be linked to the train project itself. So what's going to happen is the project itself carries a strong urban reorganization and displacement. Unfortunately, for example, the UN Habitat, which is the UN agency, settlements agency, gave a green light and positive report upon the impact of the project, as the plan is that it boosts the economy and job creation, and locally the locations the new settlements and urbanization of different areas. However, the very same UN reacted negatively upon how the consultations were run, saying that most likely it breaches the human rights, particularly of indigenous groups and various international agreements that the Mexico is a part of. So ejidos, this is a very interesting concept or the situation in which we have the clash in between our approach of Western civilization to the ownership, right, and the traditional approach to the ownership of the communities, indigenous groups. Ejidos, which is territory of indigenous people, that is not nobody's owning it; they own it as a community. As long as the community itself is using the territory for certain purposes, right? So we have thousands of ejidos across Mexico and across the region. The ones that are going to be directly impacted, this is the number that we are seeing. The problem now here is the model of the ownership of the particular areas where the train is going to go through. There were three design models, and all three are what in other occasions the Mexican president would be using as a neoliberal models of investments, right? To basically have the ownership open up for the investments run by the investors, including the indigenous groups. Now imagine how, if we have high levels of poverty, lack of education, what are the models of actually of manipulation with indigenous groups, and actually the territory itself, which would be opted for the financing and investments, it would be subjugated, of course, to the rules of the investments and finances, and potentially could lead to the bankrupt of the finances if let's say, comes a year of a pandemic or tourism goes down and there's not enough income, and it costs to maintain the train tracks and so on. Important part is at least 10 directly, up to 20 something natural protected sites are going to be affected. Ongoing deforestation and militarization of projects. By militarization is in December 2021. In December 2020, sorry, the Mexican president declared that the army is going to take the ownership of certain parts of the roads and is going to be leading the construction. This is no new thing, that army actually becomes a constructor and a project management and the project manager of the project itself. We have another case of the airport, and the idea is that the army actually finances its retirements and other funds and projects from the profits earned from the train itself. Courts are reacting, groups are putting through the judicial suspensions or so-called injunctions. However, majority of these injunctions that are supposed to be sorted out and decided in a fast track are actually protracted. So we don't see enough of the judicial support for the indigenous groups. This is a forest land use change. Some of the tracks are literally using current laws for the networks that is being used in electricity to take out the land. These are the changes, right? For example, here's where the road is used to be a local road. Now we see the deforestation processes currently happening. These are the before and after images. Why is this so? Because in the declaration of when the State Commission for the Protection of Environment and representative for the president of it was claiming that there's not going to be new deforestation because the train is going to be using the existing roads to be built, which is not the case. Actually, as the construction goes, the route is being changed. They change. Even the parts of the train tracks are being built, and then they decide to retract, right, to change the track. So the biggest, we can leave these problems actually for the talk if somebody comes up with the questions or something. But big problem is the influx, high level of influx, even if we build the train, of the tourism and what it makes for the changes of the traditional style of living of the indigenous community. There is no current ongoing projects of how to protect their traditional lifestyles and the production, ecotourism that are currently leading. And why am I bringing this story? Because I'm trying to figure out how to approach this issue from the perspective that we have heard yesterday in the plenary session when the white paper was launched, that we have to transform our, even what actually Fábio was talking about. He was referring a lot into the environmental peace building, how to transform even and to look from the other side. The US Institute of Peace president was talking about it, to make actually the environmental, not peace building, but even environmental conflict prevention. So this has a high potential of boosting conflict and insecurity in the region. So my idea is to look into the theoretical aspects of how to use environmental peace building for the sake of environmental conflict prevention. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry for going out of the time limits. Thank you very much, guys.
Many thanks, Nicola. Okay, and so I'll very quickly share the screen for Elaine. If I can. Okay, so Elaine is our third and final speaker. As you can see there in the extended bio, Elaine is an assistant professor in peace and conflict studies in Kent, I think, in the US. And she's also a co-chair of one of the specialist groups, I think, at the IUCN. So I will hand the floor over to Elaine.
Thank you, Karen, and thanks everyone for joining. I am like Nicola a little bit, the voice is also waking up, as is the brain, I hope. So let me see if I can try to share this with you all. I just did this a little bit ago, so let's see. Okay. Does that look okay? Are you seeing the slides again?
That's
okay.
Great, thanks.
Okay, so this is a talk on, or a presentation on a paper that's coming out in Conservation and Society for a special issue on convivial conservation. And convivial conservation, for those of you who maybe haven't been exposed to it a little bit yet, is some of the work that's been coming out of Wageningen University and their affiliates, partly to address this conversation that's happening in the conservation world around half Earth versus whole Earth. So it's about humans and the rest of nature coexisting convivially. And so what I've done with this paper is to try to think about what does ecological peace and kind of our approaches to conflict resolution between humans and other species from the perspective of kind of our more traditional concepts of peace, so positive peace and negative peace. And ecological peace, I defined it as a state of harmony or species cooperation, borrowing from the words of Johann Galtung, between humans and the rest of nature, premised on an ethic or relationship of mutual care and respect. So again, we can think about this in terms of positive ecological peace, the absence of direct physical violence, structural violence, cultural violence, and then negative ecological peace, where we haven't quite obtained that structural, the absence of structural cultural violence, but we're trying to at least strive for freedom from direct physical violence. So this part is a bit conceptual, but what I tried to do is to look at it in the context of a very specific location. So in this case, Akagera National Park, which sits on the eastern border of Rwanda, along the Akagera River, which divides Rwanda and Tanzania. And to the north, you have Uganda. So Akagera National Park is Rwanda's Big Five National Park, which is an important thing to think about in this context. And it's also what I call a disrupted socio-natural landscape. So socio-natural is, as Siegel defines it, that inextricably intertwined domains of human action and the physical environment that's inherent to ecological peace. So it's the human and the social and the ecological as kind of one, rather than these divided units that we try to link in different ways. and humans. And I, use ecological peace instead of environmental peace because it speaks to humans as part of the ecosystem. And in disruption, in this case, I'm talking about things like armed conflict, colonization, globalization, and development, but also conservation itself, particularly in the forms of, the sort of fortress territorialization. And, because these are the things that shape how we approach peace with other species, how we interact with them, and how we perceive non-human species. And in the case of Akagera National Park, I'm looking at 3 very specific types of human-wildlife conflict interventions. So that includes the electric boundary fence. So the entire park is surrounded by an electric fence. And on the western side, basically, you have the Akagera River, which is not penetrable by species. So it's essentially an island now, a fragmented sort of ecological island. And then also looking at the financial mechanisms, in particular compensation for human-wildlife conflict damages. So this is, when crops get raided or livestock are killed, there are payouts to the people who've lost property. So financial incentives designed to sort of offset the cost of living with wildlife, and thinking about that as a more kind of liberal approach, to negative ecological peace. Then we have sort of the cultural and traditional or local knowledge around human and other species coexisting, and trying to think about that more as what might be positive ecological peace. So Akagera National Park was gazetted in 1934. It's, protected one of the largest wetlands in Africa. So as I mentioned, this is the part of the Akagera River watershed, which then connects to the Nile River Basin. And it is Rwanda's only Big 5 game park, which means that it's a very important tourist draw. And it's also, because of its proximity to Kigali, the capital, the central capital, it makes it very accessible, kind of like Nicola was talking about with tourism. It reclaimed its title of being a Big 5 game park in 2017 because of the reintroduction of lions in 2015 and then the eastern black rhinos in 2017. And it's been heavily, as I mentioned, suffered from that socio-natural disruption. In 1997, for example, it was re-gazetted at half of its original size to try to accommodate large populations of refugees that were settled inside of the park and in the neighboring Mutara hunting fields. Within a decade after the war, Fábio was talking about post-conflict. Within a decade after the genocide, basically both lions and rhinos were extirpated, so extinct locally. Before the park was established, actually, it wasn't very populated. There were, pastoralist communities utilizing some of the grassland areas in the northern Mutara rangelands, mainly the Bahima, and then in the eastern region along the Akagera riverbank. But most of the woodlands were considered not so inhabitable because of the tsetse flies and the marshlands. So it was not very useful land for most of the time. And that's kind of the south and central regions of the park. So the park is there in that black outlined section. And then the pieces you see in color are the villages alongside it. So basically what we can say is that civil war and genocide changed the human geographies of Akagera dramatically, bringing in refugee populations from different parts of the country. During the genocide, we were talking about 2 million refugees, another 1 million internally displaced. And before that, Akagera had already been turned into a humanitarian site for many Ugandan refugees, with over 45,000 people, sometimes as many as 1,500 arriving daily, and tens of thousands, at least 50,000 cattle brought into camps in Kanyinya, Mahega, Kibondo, in and around the national park. And after the plane crash of President Habyarimana, the park became a throughway or a battleground for the Rwanda Patriotic Front's Liberation Army, which was returning through Uganda back to Rwanda. So it's in terms of the humans in the landscape, it was quite interesting, but it really wasn't very settled until recently, when many of the IDPs and refugees were given land there. Today, we're estimating that about 300,000 people live around the park. And I chose kind of two sites, two villages to look at. Muchuchu, they're in the central dark red area, and then Gasabo in the south, because basically you're looking at one of the areas with the highest instances of human wildlife conflict complaints, and then Gasabo in the south with much less that's actually touching the park. In 2009, African Parks, many of you may have heard of, came into partnership with the Rwanda Development Board, which is their protected area management authority, and formed the Akagera Management Company. And so this became a public-private partnership to manage the park for wildlife security and tourism development as kind of the top two priorities. And as I mentioned earlier, 2015, they reintroduced lions. 2017, they reintroduced rhinos. At the time, you know, for example, the European zoos who donated the rhinos saw this as an important opportunity to return the descendants of captive rhinos back to their homeland, you know, but they wanted to know that the animals would be safe in a country where they had been wiped out twice before, right? And so this effort towards decolonizing the ex situ conservation resulted in many ways in a recolonization of fortress conservation in Akagera National Park. So prior to those reintroductions, in 2013, construction of a 120-kilometer electric fence around the park's boundary was made. And it was supported, you know, by anti-poaching measures, ranger training, intro of bloodhounds, new surveillance technologies, etc. So very much, you know, the refortressing. This fence has correlated strongly with a reduction in direct physical violence by people against wildlife, if we're looking at it in terms of numbers such as poaching inside of the national park. In 2014, it was said that there were 595 snares were found. By 2015, there were only 7. But you can see in that first quote there by a Gasabo villager, you know, that there was a noticeable difference. As Posiyani Tibagirwa says, there's a huge difference. Before they fenced the park, wild animals would kill people. They would come all the way from the park and damage communities' crops and kill people, but now it's different. So you can see maybe that there's some semblance of negative ecological peace. But it's also changed the relationship between people and the species that they related to previously, right? In the second quote, you have a traditional healer who uses medicinal plants, saying that we're now aware that the park is guarded. It has a fence. There is literally a frontier between people and park. So she's no longer able to access many of the plants that she had a relationship with previously. And, you know, on top of this, the fence is actually not completely impervious, right? Smaller species like vervet monkeys, young leopards, etc., they can still move across the fence, and many species have, you know, consistently kind of persisted outside of the park where they've always been, right? Creating basically, you know, what we might think of as the park as a de jure area of human wildlife visitation, you know, and then all the outside areas as kind of a de facto area of human wildlife cohabitation. And the local communities and on top of this are constantly being trained how to upgrade their livestock infrastructures, meaning that the park fence has also resulted in many more community fences. So not only separating wildlife from humans, but also domesticated animals. And this constant reinforcement of a false sense of separation can basically degrade people's desires for coexistence. You know, and this is evidenced through the perceptions of certain species as desirable versus undesirable, right? And oftentimes we also approach human wildlife conflicts from the second kind of intervention that I talk about, you know, the compensation schemes. And this is because we think about human wildlife conflicts as an economic cost benefit, right? And we see, you know, certain wildlife as an economic cost, which must be reconciled in terms of compensation for the losses or that they're causing to livelihoods or some sort of, you know, income streams. But this can be exploited, right? One landowner filed at least 14 different verified complaints during this period of a study about livestock losses and did nothing to prevent or minimize the future damages. Basically, he'd figured out he could make money off of this, you know, and so if you have system savvy people, then we're really talking about compensation as a liberal peace approach, right? Driven by, or coexistence driven by an economic incentive. And again, I would argue that it leads only to negative ecological peace because of its stigmatization of problem animals, its commodification of the other species, and its reliance on this constant relocation and separation of wildlife. So one of the things about the compensation scheme is that it speaks to, you know, that you can only get these payouts if this wildlife actually originated from the park. But in most cases, like I was talking about, there are many species that have always been outside of the park and they were just fenced, you know, on one side versus the other. But what this, you know, the compensation mechanism does is it drives this desire to kind of put the animals back into the park or just to move them where they weren't before, actually, which is inside of the protected area. And, you know, the other thing too is that the compensation mechanism is paid for by tourism of the animals inside of the park, right? So you're talking about, you know, it basically becomes more profitable to move the problem animals into the park where they can now become an income stream, right? And in the long term, you know, this kind of moving, the constant moving of animals into the park can basically threaten their long-term resilience and survival, right? They're becoming, like I mentioned in the very beginning, part of a very fragmented island. To give another example also of how wildlife relocation can be deeply problematic for ecological peace, we can look at the elephants found in Akagera National Park today. They actually weren't there before. In 1975, a herd of about 150 elephants were basically creating conflict with the local communities in Bugesera. And there weren't any elephants, like I said, in Akagera at the time, but they believed that possibly there used to be a historic corridor from Bugesera, which was kind of more southern Rwanda, to Uganda. So they thought that it might be viable, you know, ecologically to move these elephants there. So they did that. They transferred 26 of these elephants by military trucks, helicopters, all-terrain vehicles, cages, strongboats, etc. But, you know, because, you know, the movement of elephants is quite difficult, and at that time the technology was a bit different, they only moved elephants that were 8 years, and under, the ones that basically weren't as large. So every other one that was bigger was shot and killed. 4 of the young elephants were so young that they weren't even ready to be weaned from their mothers and had to be bottle fed on arrival. So, you know, we're talking about forced displacement of a species with violent decimation of their herds. And this at the time was celebrated as something that was groundbreaking as a conservation effort to eliminate human-wildlife conflict. But definitely what I would consider negative ecological peace. So where I find hope, though, is for positive ecological peace is in the cultural knowledge of human-wildlife relations. So as the definition of ecological peace notes, right, these relationships need to be premised on mutual care. So in that first quote, you'll see there that people care for and protect species that do the same for them. Right, going back to Posiyani, the Gasabo villager, he says, we also have native species in our farms. They were there when we got here and I didn't cut all of them because, for example, the tall trees, you can even put in a beehive for bees. You can conduct horticulture and harvest honey to eat, so you can't cut those. And for palm trees, these craft women use it. And that's why we can't cut these trees. So again, that relationship between the other species and the humans, and why we then engage in mutual care. There's traditional knowledge is also based on a culture of peace, right? Shaped by norms around, for example, totems and taboos. There was one Musean elderman who explained that his totem is the lion, which he could never kill. And he was very happy to see the lions returned into Akagera National Park. He also described a small frog, the totem of his wife, which he protects as well, right? Because he considered this the relative of his in-laws. The small frog actually isn't native to the Akagera region, but he says that basically any other species which is like that one is considered something that he would protect. So this practice, cultural practice, spills over to apply to the species that are found in that place. And also the other thing is that for many people now living in this landscape, they had been uprooted from other places and didn't necessarily have local ecological knowledge, right? But they now needed to negotiate coexistence with these species. So they found ways to learn from each other. So you see there in the second one, there were no hippos, but you see when you move to a new area, people teach you different tricks on animals' behavior and you start being careful. So you learn from the people who have been exposed to these species. And basically what that indicates to me is that there's some hope for the revitalization of local ecological knowledge, even in disrupted socio-natural landscapes that can potentially bring us closer to positive ecological peace. So I will leave it there. I hope I didn't go too far over time. Thank you. Thanks most of all to all of the people in Rwanda who participated in my research and for all of you for listening. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to all of our speakers. I have not seen any questions in the chat, so I assume our speakers have answered all your questions already. Oh, hang on. Okay, so we have one. Let me have a look. Okay, so I think this one is particularly for Elaine. So hopefully I'm pronouncing your name right, Natalia, unless you want to ask the question yourself.
And I can, if it's okay.
Yes, absolutely. Do you want to put your camera on as well? I can't figure out which of the black squares is you.
I'm okay not going
Okay.
on camera, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
So thank you, all of you, actually, for your presentations. Very grateful to be here. The question to you, Elaine, is how might the expanded scope of ecological peace lead to greater peace between humans? And then a secondary question is why peace and not peace building or peacemaking in this case?
Okay, thank you, Natalia, for that question. I think it's really great. Couple questions, actually. So I'll start maybe with just how does it lead to greater peace between humans? So one thing is that human-wildlife conflicts actually are often thought about as social conflicts that involve a species. And especially around protected areas, this happens because, again, you have that attribution of sort of the origin or the responsibility for the species to the protected area. And so oftentimes the conflict with that particular species actually becomes a conflict with the park and represented by the park management or the park authorities. So a lot of times, you know, the ways that it's always the park management that then brings in these interventions that are meant to resolve what we call human wildlife conflicts, but actually often are park community conflicts. So that's, you know, one way that we think about that. And the other thing kind of is to put this into the bigger context of what's happening globally. You know, because of the biodiversity crisis, climate change, et cetera, we have this push for expanding conservation areas around the world. That's the 30 by 30 half Earth sort of goal, right? This greater, you know, conservation of areas and territories. And so, you know, there's a movement or to try and actually create more of these kinds of protected areas, park spaces, which then, you know, creates an interface, a borderline, very artificial in many ways, right? As I tried to kind of talk about, even with the fence, the hard bordering that still is sort of imperfect. And that actually could lead to kind of, well, it already is creating quite a lot of debate within the conservation community about whether we need to approach this from a different way, and less about territorialization and this refortressing, as I've kind of tried to illustrate. And what may happen on the ground if these kinds of areas do actually get expanded in countries all around the world. So to think about countries trying to put in new protected areas and what that might mean for potentially displacing people. And as I've tried to also illustrate this, you know, the displacement of species into the parks, you know, so I think that also is a social conflict aspect of it that comes up. The other thing that you asked was why peace instead of peace building, or I think I kept it generic because I wanted it then to be able to, then you can bring in, well, is this ecological peace building? Is this ecological peacemaking? Because, you know, but if you just talk about peace generically and what that might look like, then we can look at the different forms of peace building, peacemaking, and think about it in those sort of conventional peace terms. You know, is this a liberal approach? Is this a negative peace approach, et cetera, et cetera?
There is there's a follow-up question in the chat as well. If I just ask Elaine that one again, I think it's from Natalia. Would donut economics be within the scope of ecological peace? I am not an economist.
It's been a long time since I heard that term, and so I think I need someone to define it for me. I'm sorry.
No, go for it, please.
No, it's Dutch. The author, the economist, Kate. Oh my God, I think it's still early. But anyway, it's a concept that explores the ecological or planetary boundaries, right, in the various categories, and combines it internally with the social elements and social, which means how to secure the economical growth works in the benefit of the planetary boundaries with the development of the social aspects, right? The healthy life, education, and so on. So I think definitely yes. I mean, currently we have the cases in which formally, officially, the donut economics has been applied in urban settlements, Amsterdam and in the Netherlands. The city Amsterdam has accepted the approach of donut economics in its own development. So it's not necessarily something new, but it's interesting the way how they are building up the concept of that's exactly what I feel that in the majority of the current projects that we are facing here in Mexico is actually missing, is putting things kind of hand in hand. And why I didn't bring this case, why is it interesting actually, the case of different Mexican projects, is that we finally, it was believed, we got the political context and situation in Mexico in which we had the political leaders who in their discourse and narrative picked up a lot of the elements which we believe that we're going to be put into practice then, of looking differently into the things that we need, right? Looking differently into the reshaping the models of the development itself. But what we are seeing actually is entirely top-down approach. I would dare to say, though this is a very sensitive, of even a neo-colonial way how the government currently in Mexico is pushing the projects. So the question is, what kind of a political context in the future are we going to need to have in order to actually to put in practice what we are theoretically here discussing? Even if we have people who are projecting themselves and presenting and identifying themselves as representative of indigenous population, if they come with a hands-on ready projects for them to be implemented without any sort of respect for the human rights and the rights of the indigenous population here, at least in Mexico. So the donut economics, Natalia, definitely. However, I feel that pretty much the way how the concept is being developed and shaped currently is for somewhat more developed countries, and the way about what I remember about it, and particularly for even more thinking about the urban cities and regions, right?
Elaine, did you want to respond, or shall I move to a different question? Or shall I give you a minute to think?
I think, well, maybe I'll just say quickly, and this is based on a very imperfect understanding of donut economies, but I think what it reminded me of actually is the situation where I was talking about the compensation schemes, where, you know, this ends up creating a scenario where the non-human species are being moved into the national park in order to provide, you know, an additional economic kind of benefits, and that, as I was saying, could threaten the long-term kind of security of that species. And then, you know, if you have kind of these increasingly isolated populations of species, especially things like elephants that typically have large range habitats, then you're talking about, you know, the possibility of losing these in numbers. And, you know, we all know that these ecological islands are incredibly fragile. And if they're you know, if we think about it in terms of these species or these ecological areas as the basis of environmental security for human populations, then maybe there's a connection there. Is that speaking to donut economics at all in the right way?
Yeah, I mean, as long as the economy functions within the subset of the ecosystem and social boundaries, then it's, I guess, donut economics. So yeah, thanks.
Okay. Yeah, but this is creating a scenario where the ecological setting becomes increasingly small, right, and fortressed, confined, right? So I think that actually limits the future kind of long-term possibilities.
Okay, I've got a very lengthy question from Kimberly in the chat. So you're all going to experience how well I can read now. But thanks for that, Kim. Okay, so she starts off with a comment and then there's a question. So research has shown that animals have sophisticated communication systems, make collective group decisions and desire relationships among their own species and with others. Species that have been studied in depth, she says, include elephants, chimpanzees, prairie dogs, orcas, bats, dogs, etc. We are only really beginning to understand the complexity of their inner lives. So she asks the question, have you seen any examples of humans attempting to understand the preferences of wild animals as a pathway to interspecies harmony? Who wants to tackle that first? Have you seen any examples?
Yeah. I cannot talk about the research itself. I can only talk about what I have seen when I go to visit the communities, and even if you come to Mexico as a tourist, this is something that you face immediately, whether you go to the Azteca temples or you go to Mayan sites and so on. You can see how much the indigenous population cherishes the nature and the animals, who are the principal gods, the jaguar, for example, the snakes and so on, of the population. And that doesn't come as only their fear out of it, but actually the understanding. I have different archives, right, from indigenous population that I picked up and all of them are certain representation of the animals. So this is something that is being then placed in danger with these massive mega projects. The traditional, when we refer to the effects of the modern development projects on the traditional lifestyles, is actually influencing this balance in between the people, indigenous people in these regions, and their traditional lives, because often we believe that the modern style of the development is something that they do need in order to boost their inequalities and the poverty, without actually reaching out to understand the meaning of the life that they give to themselves for their own communities, believing that the style of development that they need is exactly the one that we have experienced. And this then breaches and then breaks that link that they have with the environment. With the project of the train, for example, one of the big issues is how not to have the fence, right? So now the opposite of Elaine's discussion about the positive negative piece, introducing the fence that is supposed to be kind of protecting, but at the same time limiting. Actually, here train is directly invading the space in which the humans for centuries have been living in direct touch and the contact with the nature itself. I have seen the projects, how it's going to look like, the passages, very fancy, very modern style of building the train and then organizing kind of crossings over tunnels that are going to be then planted trees and nature for the species, for the wildlife to be able to pass. Now, the concept of the bridges is something that we humans are accustomed to. The question is how much actually the wildlife is going to be accustomed to figuring out where those 16 or whatever natural passages are supposed to be brought in. So I believe that this is the area in which we have much to learn from the indigenous groups on how to engage elements of the environmental protection, understanding of the nature itself, whether it's the nature trees or the animals, and to engage into peace-building efforts or conflict prevention efforts. Right. That's why I wanted to Fábio is kind of, I feel marginalized. Fábio, please, I want to use you spoke. Maybe I don't know if you were there at the panel session with inaugurating the white paper yesterday with the United States when they spoke actually about the even shift and transition from environmental peace building to actually environmental conflict prevention. So in your work, what we have seen from you, have you come across this discussion, utilization of the concept to prevent? Like, I'm now leading towards what I need from this panel.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Nicola. Well, environmental peace building is not yet a settled piece of academic as it is right now. So talking already about a transition, I think is a little bit early, at least at the moment, but it makes sense nevertheless. The issue is that what we've seen so far, especially in prevention measures in conflict scenarios, they are kind of frequently pushed away because there's a lot of controversy surrounding prevention measures and prevention interventions, not only in terms of legitimacy, but also in terms of what type of measures should be applied or not, and how should the interveners should be accountable for them. So for me, it makes sense that we move the discussion forward to try to strengthen the field, of course, and try to make this push towards prevention that is much needed. But the fact is that while environmental peace building is not yet settled in policy making and does not have a strong case, either theoretically or empirically, it is not quite certain if the field will be successful in making that transition, at least for me. Yeah. Thank you.
That's where I'm heading for, enthusiastically.
Yeah.
If it's okay, I want to add a comment to what Kimberly said, and really just kind of point out the role of scientists, because I do think of them as a subgroup of people who are out there studying species behaviors and oftentimes trying to communicate this to other people so that they can figure out how to behave around certain species to reduce some of those negative interactions, right, or harms even. You know, so we do get information sometimes from scientists saying if you're around an elephant, you want to behave like this so that it doesn't charge you, et cetera, et cetera. But I also often think about that science and that way of trying to understand other species for interspecies harmony as something which is like possibly thousands of years behind the traditional knowledge. It's just trying to learn what many traditional indigenous people have known forever. So that's why I really tried to focus on this revitalization of some of that knowledge, despite the fact that people have been displaced largely, you know, in a country like Rwanda. But if we think about anywhere that we live today, I mean, how many of us are really truly native or indigenous to our place? So we do need this kind of revitalization of that local ecological knowledge that is, and maybe some of it will come from the scientists because, I don't know, you know, that's maybe the pathway that's available to us. But it's really the richer kind of deeper, I think, knowing is coming from the indigenous knowledge, kind of as Nicola also mentioned.
Okay, I've got no more questions in the chat. So just as Nicola did before, do any of the panel want to ask each other a question? Anything you want to ask each other?
If I may.
Oh yeah, sure.
I'll like to make a follow-back question to Nicola, because it left me wondering on this issue of the indigenous population and then these green grabs, let's say, by the state and other possible business entrepreneurs that might take advantage of this opportunity to develop their businesses around stations, for example. I'd like to ask you, what do you think that would be the solution or a viable pathway for environmental peace building to be successful in here? Would you think that the solution would be to push for environmental agreements that need to be enforced in order for the state to find alternative pathways, let's say, to construct the railway, for example? Or do you think that instead we should provide these indigenous local populations the means for them to fight against the project or to find the viable alternative solutions?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So Thanks a lot. I mean, that's a great question. Actually, it picks up on where I stopped my presentation, right? So I don't need to be smart about this, right? Because there is already research being done, and people and organizations, civil society organizations, Mexican organizations for the protection under environmental law, for example, is very active in there. There's a lot of interviews with the leaders of different indigenous communities who are saying that they have to be consulted and spoken up on the model of the development that they would like to see and the biggest concerns that they have with the current model that is being developed. And that's where you come up with the possible solution. So the current solution is a different type of the ownership in which the indigenous community and the people who, not only indigenous, but all the people who will be actually affected there, create different type of the ownership over the project. Not the ownership of the project in which it's going to be clearly defined where the profits are going. Like in this case, you put the project and then you define from this section to this section, ARM is going to pick up the biggest benefits and profits out of the project. Doesn't make sense. In addition, not to talk about the militarization of the project for the future sakes, if the things go down south, when we talk, because this region is going to be increasingly affected by climate change and environmental disasters as the hurricanes are increasingly passing to the region. So how is this going to affect then something that a big model of a major money investments, we're talking about more than $20 billion investments that the region hasn't seen ever in the history in such a short period of time, that is linked to one specific sector, industry, that is highly volatile these days. And in addition, the style of development that has brought problems to other regions of Mexico, right, or including Cancun, because when you have tourists coming, not only that you have big businesses, but you have the organized crime, smuggling, drugs, and so on coming in the region. So we have the entire structure of the current state of Mexico is not ready to uphold and kind of spill over the positive effects of the project without guaranteeing the protection of the negative aspects of the project. So going back to your question, how to engage the environmental peace building and so on, is reaching out to the communities, organizing the process and keeping up the high standards that we already know when it comes to the governance of these kind of projects, when we are dealing with a region that has high levels of poverty and high levels of population of indigenous groups. So we don't have to be actually smart. We have to just apply already existing standards that we have in the governance of these kind of projects and the necessity of protection of environment. See, as simple things as such as environmental impact assessments. We cannot believe that this scale of a project in the 2020, 2021, 2022 doesn't still have for the entire project of its own environmental impact assessment. Not to talk about then socio-economical impact assessments that we are still kind of in theory struggling with to understand when we want to apply it for countries that have big population of indigenous groups and so on. Right. So I don't have to be smart about it. There is tons of interviews being conducted out there when they go and ask people, what are their greater concern? We have tremendous archaeological sites in that part of the world that are still not entirely discovered. One of the main Mayan civilization sites, graves of one of the greatest leaders in the northern part, right, of the Mayan civilization, is right there. And we only have 20% of it discovered. Now imagine if we don't have supporting infrastructure for tourism, except the train that's going to bring 50,000 people in a couple of years, and we have less than 10,000 people on today. What does it mean as a pressure on the infrastructure when it comes to water, energy, food itself, and the type of the development of tourism that we want to see being linked then to the offers and potential development of the indigenous communities? Imagine how big of people are talking about the term ecocide actually happening, because there is no follow-up of infrastructure being built around the project itself, because it costs a lot of money that Mexico cannot afford and that local communities there cannot afford. So who is going to be doing those projects? The ones who have money. Who are the ones who have money? Big businesses. Right.
Okay. Unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, fortunately, we have run out of time. So I want to thank all of our I was muted, sorry. Just wanted sorry, I'll be 1 minute, sorry. I just wanted to thank all of our speakers because we've run out of time. And I don't want to keep everybody, there's a very short gap between now and the wards and dialogue session. So please do encourage everybody to attend that. And again, thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you to our audience and everybody who asked a question. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
See
Thank you very much. Thank Karen for coordination and everything.
Yeah, thanks.
Nice to meet you, guys. Bye.
Bye. See you around.
Thanks, Elaine. I'll be in touch.